Well, over the course of the last, roughly, in my estimation, 120 years, our nation has been under an attack from within. You say, wait a minute, what kind of attack are you talking about, Seth? Well, if you don't follow the news, court cases that are going on, if you don't follow politics, if you're not a C-SPAN junkie like I am who enjoys watching senatorial hearings, you may wonder, what kind of attack are we under? If you don't watch any of that, you may feel the attack in some of the following ways. How many of you have, in the last year or so, when you start to watch the news, after about 5 minutes, just turn it off, I can't take it anymore? Discouragement or anger? That's sort of one thing we sense. Or maybe you sense that latent fear inside of us that you better not say anything politically incorrect, even to friends, or even what might be construed as politically correct by some. There are reasons for that. Our nation is under an attack from within. Or I think about two things that seem to have just about vanished from our culture. Common sense and common courtesy just seems to slowly be withering away. Or maybe you think about what's happening to our country in general, and you think about the increase of crime, particularly in our cities, and now bleeding over into suburbs. Or you think about those who talk about the immigration and as if the border is secure in their estimate, and yet the facts are quite the opposite of that. Or you think about what's happened to our economy. What's happened to our economy? I don't remember our economy being like this since the Jimmy Carter days. High inflation and high interest rates, soaring national debt, and many of the folks on one side of the political spectrum seem to think that things are generally fine. If you are upset about what's happening in school boards and curriculum and with the National Teachers Association, you may wonder, or just in general, what's happened to morality in our country? For somebody my age, this is not the country I grew up in. Something is changing. And in my estimation, we are under attack. What are we under attack on? Again, in my judgment, I think the big target on our back is the Judeo-Christian truth, principles, and the work ethic, and all the principles that go with how we are as people and how society is to form. Related to that, as a history major in college, I remember reading some of the different American historians who claim that we were not a Christian nation at our beginning. And it was very odd to think that, because I was reading a lot of literature from the founding of our country in the late 1700s, 18th century, and I loved the founding of our country. And how these 56 men put together a government is so amazing to me. And yet we're not a Christian nation, they say. And so part of what happens is, well, they say, well, where's the Bible in the Declaration of Independence, or where's the Bible in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights? Now, I will give the benefit of the doubt to those who do not know the Bible and do not read the Bible, as to say there's a reason why you cannot identify the truths in our government, our Declaration of Independence, Constitution, and Bill of Rights, if you are not a Bible student. I would not expect you to. But one of the things that we do have as a historian is that the Constitutional Convention, which began in May 25th of 1787, lasted till the middle of September. Those guys kept a journal every day. And with the journal, you can think of a court reporter today. And they recorded everything that those guys said for almost 4 months. And as a historian, what you can do is you can go back and read the journal to what those guys actually said, which is pretty amazing. The University of Houston did a study a number of years ago where they took 15,000 writings of our founders, not just during the Constitutional Convention. And during that time, they studied who was quoted the most in those debates. John Locke was quoted 2.9% of the time, who wrote the two treaties of government about 100 years before Revolution and Declaration of Independence. And in his writings, this was probably one of the two premier English jurists, political theorists, he quoted the Bible over 1,500 times in those two books. Sir William Blackstone was the second, probably one of the preeminent English theorists on English law, upon which English law is built, a lot of his writings. He was quoted, I think, 7.9%, and Montesquieu from France was quoted 8.3% of the time. The Bible was quoted 34% of the time. And yet somehow we are not a Christian nation, as some would say. The Declaration of Independence, we have some copies of this up here that Lori brought, and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. This is a copy of the Declaration of Independence, and you'll see the 56 signers at the bottom. We the people, the Constitution of the United States. And the original Bill of Rights, of which there were 12, and then they ended up making 10. But one of the things that's been is happening in our culture on this battle is to separate the Declaration of Independence from the Constitution. And the reason it is because the Declaration of Independence is sort of like the Articles of Incorporation for a church or a business. The Articles of Incorporation for a business or a church tell us this is what we're about. And the Constitution is sort of like the bylaws of the corporation or the church. And the bylaws tell us how we're supposed to operate. That's got the details here. And so what you find here is that the men who wrote the Constitution depended on the Declaration of Independence for the Articles of Incorporation type of thing, defining who we are. John Quincy Adams wrote, and this is in your handout, the virtue which had been infused into the Constitution of the United States was no other than the concretion of those abstract principles which had first been proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence. This was the platform upon which the Constitution of the United States had been erected. There is no separation in those guys' minds of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So what I'd like to do today is to go over 9 principles that are biblical principles that undergird, you can find them in the Declaration of Independence or inferred in the Constitution. And they are, God governs over the affairs of man, which was extremely important to these guys. Self-evident truths, all men are created equal, a fixed moral law, we are endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights. A government exists to protect inalienable rights. The consent of the governed and to change the government is implicit in our rights, and the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that's where we're headed here. Number 1, God governs over the affairs of man. These guys were students of history. They studied ancient history. They studied Old Testament history. They studied Greek history, Roman history. They studied European history. And they were trying to figure out, how can we break the overall pattern of a civilization is birthed, it rises in prominence, and eventually torpedoes itself? How does that happen? What can we do to try to prevent that? And they had not found an example that violated that particular trend. Everyone, there was a rise in power and power overstep, and eventually it dethroned itself. That's what they were trying to do. And one of the things that they realized was that most despots, kings, monarchs, whoever you want to put it, saw themselves as the highest authority of government and law. And what these guys said, there's problem number 1. Because if government has the top ability to proclaim what is legal and right, and what your rights are, it can take those things away, which is precisely why they were revolting against England. 2 Chronicles 20, verse 6 says, Lord, the God of our ancestors, are you not the God who is in heaven? You rule over all the kingdoms of the nations. Power and might are in your hand, and no one can withstand you. In their mind, God needed to be the pinnacle point, the highest point in terms of law and rights. Second principle, self-evident truths. Self-evident truths. Jeremiah 31:33 says, this is the covenant, God speaking, which I will make with my people. I will put my law in their heart. I will put my law in their hearts and their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God and they will be my people. Romans says the same thing, is that human nature intuitively knows what is right to do. Now, whether we do it or not is a whole different matter. Who knows what's going to happen there? Hey, good to see you guys. It's a whole different matter. But at least we're not trying to guess as to what is right and what is wrong. These things are intuitively written in our hearts. They are self-evident. Third, all men are created equal. Revelation 5:9 says, you are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals because you were slain. And with your blood you purchased for God persons from every tribe, every language, and people and nation. Now, even though this ideal that all men are created equal remained an ideal for about 75 years in our country, at least the underpinnings to overthrow slavery were put in the Declaration of Independence. And it was up to those signers to figure out, can we eradicate slavery in the Constitution? During those almost 4 months of debate, they could not do that without not agreeing on a Constitution, having enough votes to do that. And so they did what politicians are great doing. They kicked the thing down the road. And it took another 75 years, and through all kinds of Supreme Court legislation or decrees that sometimes put the matter backwards, or the 1850 Missouri Compromise, or the 1820 Compromise. In spite of all of that, eventually Civil War happened, and by the end of that, and after the loss of 620,000 men in battle over 4 years, the 13th Amendment, 14th, and 15th Amendment were ratified in the Constitution. And at that point, no sane person thought that slavery was a good idea anymore in our country. The beginning seed of that was this notion of that all men are created equal. On the inside of your handout, the fourth one is that there's a fixed moral law. A fixed moral law. And the way that the framers put this was, and in political theory, this is how it was written, the laws of nature and nature's God. Now, the laws of nature and nature's God, what does that mean? Well, theologians talk about there's two kinds of revelation, the way God reveals himself and truth to us. There's special revelation, or specific revelation, and general revelation. General revelation is in Romans 1 is our ability to look out at our world around us and to draw a conclusion that there is a God and the kind of God that he is. That's what the framers called the laws of nature. Special revelation or specific revelation are things like Jesus Christ telling us who God is, revealing who God is, or the scriptures. This is the laws of nature and nature's God. Both of these is what they saw here. And what they inferred was there is a natural order to things as they observed, and a moral order. And it's important to go by that order rather than try to reject that order or to kick against it. The book of Judges and in the Bible and much of Old Testament history is replete with examples of people who tried to do that. The book of Judges is probably one of the lowest points of history until they were finally overrun by the Assyrians and the Babylonians, where the people for a number of generations decided to do what every man thought was right in his own eyes. That was the killer belief for generation after generation that took the people of Israel down, 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 and slowly destroyed their country. Now think about that. The people did what was right in their own eyes. How many times do you hear that out in our culture? In our secular culture, that is a value. You just have to do what is right for you. Really? You think that's a good idea? The Bible says that's a terrible idea. You have to do what God thinks is right, not just what I think. Psalm 19:7 says, "The law of the Lord is perfect, refreshing the soul. The statutes of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, giving joy to the heart. The commands of the Lord are radiant, giving light to the eyes. The fear of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. The decrees of the Lord are firm, and all of them are righteous. Your word, Lord, is eternal. It stands firm in the heavens." There is a fixed moral law, and our Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution is built partly on that platform, a fixed moral law. Fifth, we are endowed by our divine Creator. And this sort of has two, divine Creator and endowed. And they went back to Genesis 1, verse 26. It's a verse we've read a lot this year in this series on grace and truth. "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock, all the wild animals, and over all creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them." So here, this is what theologians call the cultural mandate or the great mandate. Now, as you read this, you might think, well, it sounds like is he just telling Adam and Eve to farm some land and be a rancher and try to keep from getting eaten by lions? These verses here are sort of like a vision statement of a company. This is the direction we're headed. This is the big picture. And as you read on in Genesis, and of course in the rest of the Bible, you realize that what God is saying to these folks is something much bigger than just farm the land and eat from the trees that I give you. Verse 28, "God blessed them and said, 'Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, over every living creature.' Verse 28, "I give you every seed-bearing plant in the face of the whole earth, every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth and all the birds in the sky and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food." And it was so. Again, this is a vision statement. And as you read on, what the folks are trying to do with God's help is to create marriages that are healthy and families that are healthy and where children can grow up in safe environments. Where we are led to create towns and farms and commerce and organize ourselves socially and in government as needed to build a civilizations that are righteous and just. This is the great mandate. We are still a part of that great mandate, and that's part of what we are. We have God-given responsibilities to fulfill that mandate, and it's inferred that we have rights from God to pursue those mandates and our stewardship of our responsibilities. We are free to do that. We should be free. Sixth, inalienable rights. We looked a little bit about this last week, but the simple thing to think about here is the parable of the talents, where the manager was getting ready to leave town for a while, and he had some servants, and he divided up his property and his holdings, and he gave to one 5 shares of it, and another he gave 2 shares, and another 1 share. And what was expected was what these fellows would invest the shares that they were given for the sake of the master. And to not do that, the one who did not do that, who just kept it to himself, when Jesus finishes the parable, he says, "That wicked and lazy servant." He did not fulfill the stewardship of his responsibilities. And that was a big problem here. These are inalienable rights that God has given to us to fulfill our stewardships. The 7th principle, government exists to protect inalienable writes. Romans 13, 1 through 7 talks about this specifically. But in 1 Timothy 2, first of all, urge that entreaties and prayers, petitions and thanksgiving be made on behalf of all men, for kings and all who are in authority. We're to pray for our government officials. Why? And he says, in order that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. If you take this plus Romans 13, the role of government is to protect us not just from enemies foreign, but also enemies domestic and for crime. The role of government is to try to provide a social order in which you and I can function and fulfill, give attention to our responsibilities and our stewardships. J.P. Moreland said, in this text we are called to pray for kings and those in governing authority. And it is not a stretch to think we are to pray for them to be successful in fulfilling their proper function. What is that function? They are to sustain a stable order in which people can live peaceably and quietly without fear of harm. Now, over the last 4 or 5 years, roughly, we have had in our culture a movement called Defund the Police. And largely it has been in blue states and blue cities, governed cities. And the belief of those who lead this assume that mankind is basically good, and that when man does something bad or does something crime, the issue is not him or her. The issue are the institutions are corrupt, or society is corrupt, or the judicial system is corrupt. Now, as we said last week, corruptness is always going to be a part of any government. And the reason is because there's a corruptness in each one of us that is inescapable. We do not do what we know we should do sometimes, and we don't do what we know we should do sometimes. Of course, institutions, society, government, schools, business, churches, there's going to be a level of corruptness in it. This should not be a surprise. But the element of defunding the police is what the Proverbs would call naive, or more specifically, the simpleton. There are 5 different kinds of fools in the book of Proverbs. One of them is the simpleton, the naive. And this is illustrated in the defund the police. Now, not surprising to me or the Bible is when you defund the police, you're going to have more crime. And we have facts now that can do that. Crime is up almost everywhere. The latest is the Smash and Grab Institute, where some prosecutors are not even prosecuting that as crime. The simplest answer I can think of to this defund the police nonsense comes from Ecclesiastes 8:11. When the sentence for a crime is not quickly carried out, people's hearts are filled with schemes to do wrong. This is a statement about the corruptness of human nature. It's one of the reasons why in our Constitution we have the right to a speedy trial. It's not just for the sake of the person who's been arrested. The speedy trial is for the sake of all of us as far as protection. It comes from this particular principle here. The 8th principle is consent to the governed. We looked at this last week. 1 Samuel 8, God gave that to the people. John Francis Mercer, a delegate to the Constitution Convention, said this: "It is a great mistake to suppose that the paper we are to propose will govern the United States," meaning the Constitution. "It is the men whom it will bring into the government an interest in maintaining it that is to govern them." It's one thing to put this on paper, and these guys did, in my opinion, the greatest that I'm aware of job of putting together a Constitution ever written. However, it still has to be run by men and women, and therein lies the problem. "It is the men whom it will bring into the government and interest in maintaining it that is to govern them. The paper will only mark out the mode and the form. Men are the substance and women and must do the business." The 9th one is the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. I suspect that most people, if they've not heard very much of any of the others, have heard of this one. The right to life is clearly laid out in the Bible, Genesis 1, Psalm 139. describe that most clearly. The right to liberty is included in the inalienable rights and our responsibility and stewardships to carry out the great mandate or the cultural mandate. And the pursuit of happiness, unlike our culture, happiness 250 years ago meant the ability to accomplish what you wanted to do in terms of your work, finances, and economy. And here the idea was intuition, initiative, diligence, industry, honesty, and work were to be rewarded. And the role of government was to try to provide a platform where anybody could do that. And over the last 200 years, we have had people who've come from every nook and cranny from our world for that opportunity. The opportunity that our government provides for people to come where they don't have it in their own countries. The role of government, from these guys' point of view, was not to provide for the people. In fact, they debated that idea, and they eschewed that as a never-ending well that eventually would consume the country. Well, let me just wrap up with several different things. God was revealed and empowered in the Constitutional Convention. This is on the backside of your handout. The real wonder is that the Constitutional Convention overcame so many difficulties. Remember, this happened over the course of almost 4 months from 50-plus men from 13 different colonies. To overcome them with so much agreement was as unprecedented as it was unexpected. It is impossible for the pious man not to recognize in it a finger of that almighty hand which was so frequently extended to us in the critical stages of the revolution. James Madison. James Madison was one of the heroes in this whole endeavor. For my own part, Alexander Hamilton, I sincerely esteem a system which, without the finger of God, never could have been suggested and agreed upon by such a diversity of interests. Just trying to get people, half a dozen people, to agree on almost anything. And you see the amazing ability and what happened here, that God intervened in terms of how these men saw it. George Washington said, as to my sentiments with respect to the new Constitution, it appears to me little short of a miracle. It demonstrates as visibly the finger of providence as any possible event in the course of human affairs can ever designate. He was the president of the Constitutional Convention there at Independence Hall for 4 months, where these debates and writings were going on back and forth trying to put the Constitution together. Now, in the secular world of history, Benjamin Franklin is usually thought of as sort of the tail end of the Christian. And he may have been so. He may have been the weakest of the group. But about 6 weeks into the Constitutional Convention, he was sitting there and almost in despair about, is this ever going to happen? It was so slow. It was so methodical. They debated every little detail. It would have driven somebody like me absolutely nuts. And at one point on June 28th, about 6 weeks into this is what was recorded that he said. Mr. President, speaking to George Washington, president of the convention, the same progress we have made after 4 or 5 weeks' close attendance and continual reasonings with each other, our different sentiments on almost every question, several of the last producing as many noes as ayes, is methinks a melancholy proof of the imperfection of human understanding. We indeed seem to feel our own want or lack of political wisdom, since we have been running about in search of it. We have gone back to ancient history for models of government, examined the different forms of those republics which, having been formed with the seeds of their own dissolution, now no longer exist. We have viewed modern states all around Europe, but find none of their constitutions suitable to our circumstances. In this situation of this assembly, groping as it were in the dark to find political truth, and scarce able to distinguish it when presented to us. How has it happened, sir, that we have not hitherto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understanding? In the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, when the war began, when we were sensible to danger, we had daily prayer in this room for divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. All of us who were engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. Have we now forgotten that powerful friend? Or do we imagine we no longer need his assistance? I have lived, sir, a long time. And the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? The so-called secular Benjamin Franklin knew something about his Bible. I firmly believe this, and I also believe, except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. I firmly believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel. I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessings on our deliberations be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business. And that's what they did. And about 2.5 months later, almost 3 months later, they came out with that middle document, which has held us instead all these now 250 years. But in my opinion, has been under assault for about 100. You may not be aware of it if you don't follow C-SPAN or Senate hearings on judicial nominees or debates about laws that are going, or if you turn off the news like many of us do, you may not be aware of this very much at all. But it's everywhere. It's on our TV, it's in the movies, it's in our school boards, it's in many of our classrooms, virtually all around us. What you sense in a divided country is the evidence of this. We'll talk more about this next week. The ending of the Declaration of Independence, this is how these guys ended it. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, and in support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And one of the men, when they were coming to the vote, said, if we do not hang together on this, we are likely to hang separately. Let's pray together. Father, I'm reminded that the Old Testament prophets found no problem in describing what was going on in their nation and the nations around them, and calling it out when it went in a wrong direction. And Lord, I'm doing that today, in front of our folks and for the internet. The choice has been left to us. God leaves that up to his people. Either we can sit by and just let it happen and wring our hands and get discouraged and say, oh well, or we can pray and we can get involved in the politics and in issues, writing our congressman, getting involved at the school board level. writing the FBI director and the attorney general as I did about a month ago. Eventually, our government officials will stand before a much higher bar than they do here. And they will all, like us, have to face their Maker. And so will we. And may we as a people stand up for what is right and just and for our nation that you have endowed with us, our inalienable rights, our stewardships and responsibilities. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.